All right, so you've got this stack of papers in front of you, right? About the Botswana Constitution. Maybe you're like getting ready for a trip or a meeting, or hey, maybe you're just curious about this part of the world. But whatever your reason, we're going to dive deep into this thing. We'll figure out why it's so much more than just a list of rules.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating document. You can think of it like the instruction manual for running a whole country.
Mhm.
Laying out not just the laws, but the values and the principles that make Botswana tick.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. First things first, we got to understand how it's put together. And it's broken down into chapters and then parts and then sections.
Right. So imagine it like building a house. You start with the foundation, right?
Hmm.
And then you put up the walls. And then finally you get to all those details that make it feel like home. So the chapters are kind of like the foundation, parts are the walls, and then the sections are the finer points. They give it all character.
Okay, so starting with that foundation then, Chapter 1, the Republic. It seems pretty straightforward. Botswana's a republic, and they've got their official stamp, their public seal.
Right. Short and sweet. But it really does set the stage.
Hmm.
Declaring a republic means that the power belongs to the people, or, their representatives that they elect. And the public seal, well, that's their official stamp, like a signature for making laws and documents official.
Right, okay, that makes sense. So let's move on to the walls then. Starting with Chapter 2, Protection of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. I mean, this has got to be like a pretty important part of any constitution, right?
Oh, absolutely. This chapter is all about protecting individual liberties. It kicks off with Section 3, which just says, every person in Botswana is entitled. And I mean, that language is powerful. Sets the tone for the whole chapter, emphasizing these rights apply to everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from.
Yeah. And it doesn't just like talk about these rights in some kind of general way. It gets specific. So like Section 4, for example, it's about protecting the right to life. It's almost like something out of a legal thriller, Wow. You have the right to life unless certain exceptions come into play, like self-defense.
Right. It's super interesting to see how the law tries to handle those really complex situations. They try to anticipate those difficult situations and define when using force is actually justified. And then it gets even more nuanced in Section 5, protection of personal liberty. Like you can't just be detained for no reason. There has to be a lawful reason to arrest someone, like a public health emergency or something.
So they're like balancing freedom with the need to protect everyone, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a delicate balance that every democracy has to figure out. It really makes you think, if this was your country's constitution, how would you feel about these rights and these limitations?
That's a really good point. And speaking of limitations, Section 8 is all about deprivation of property. So like when can the government take your stuff? Turns out it's not so easy.
Not at all. They have to prove that it's in the public interest, and they have to provide fair compensation. It's a crucial safeguard against the government just doing whatever it wants. And speaking of safeguards, Section 9 is all about privacy of home and property. This is a big one for a lot of people, like how much privacy is enough, right?
Yeah, how does that compare to what we're used to in other countries?
Yeah, that's a good question to think about as we go along here.
Yeah.
Now, Chapter 3 is citizenship, but it's been repealed, so we can skip that one for now. So let's move on to the big players. Chapter 4, the executive. This is where we meet the president, the vice president, the cabinet.
Yeah.
The folks making those big decisions.
All right, so sounds like a powerful group. This chapter is split into 3 parts: the president and VP, the cabinet, and executive functions. So let's start at the top. How does the president get elected?
Well, that's all laid out in Section 32.
Mm-hmm.
And it's linked to the parliamentary elections, which is pretty unique. Basically, when you vote for your member of parliament, you're also kind of indirectly voting for who you want to be president.
Interesting. So it's like a 2-for-1 deal at the voting booth. What happens if the president-elect, dies before taking office? I've never even thought about that before.
Well, the Constitution has thought about it. Don't worry. Section 32 also lays out how they would trigger a new election. They've really tried to think of every scenario to make sure the transfer of power goes smoothly, even if something unexpected happens.
And of course, there's Section 41, protection from legal proceedings while in office. Seems like the president gets a lot of legal protection.
Well, it's not about giving them special treatment, really. It's more about making sure they can do their job without getting bogged down in legal stuff. But it does raise questions about accountability, doesn't it?
Right. Good point. Okay, so moving on to the cabinet and the ministers. How long do they serve? Can they just be fired whenever?
Not exactly. Section 43 says that their term is tied to the president's, unless, of course, the president removes them. So it creates a system where the executive branch operates as a team.
Makes sense. And who advises the president on policy?
Well, Section 50 points to the cabinet. It really emphasizes this idea of collective responsibility, meaning that ministers share the accountability for government decisions. It's kind of a balancing act between the power of individual ministers and the need for the government to have like a unified approach.
Man, this is starting to feel like a political thriller. All right, on to Chapter 5, Parliament. This is all about making laws and keeping the government in check.
That's right. So we'll look at the composition of Parliament, who's in it, and we'll look at the powers, what it can actually do.
So let's start with the National Assembly. Who makes up this group?
Well, you've got your elected members. They're chosen directly by the people. And then you have your specially elected members, and they're chosen through a different process. It's laid out in the first schedule, which we'll look at later. But it's an interesting mix of direct and indirect representation.
Okay, and how about the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker? How are they chosen?
Sections 59 and 60 lay out the election process. It gives us a little peek behind the curtain at how power gets distributed in Parliament. Can you imagine the debates and negotiations that must go on when choosing those key people?
Yeah, I bet. And to keep everyone honest, we have Section 75 consequences for unqualified people trying to vote.
Right. It's all about protecting the integrity of the voting process.
Yeah.
That's like a fundamental principle of any democracy.
Okay, so let's talk about the powers of Parliament. How do they actually go about making laws?
Section 87 describes the bill process. Basically, the journey an idea takes to become an actual law. It's a multi-step process designed to prevent laws from being made too quickly or without thinking them through. And that includes the president's role in giving the final approval.
Okay, so now this next part sounds kind of intimidating. Changing the Constitution itself, how does that even work?
Well, that's where Section 89 comes in. I mean, changing the foundation of an entire country is no small thing. It requires a special process, different rules. And for some changes, it requires a 2/3 majority vote. This just shows how seriously they take changing the Constitution. It should be a deliberate act and something everyone thinks carefully about.
Yeah, it sounds like they've put in some serious safeguards to keep people from just changing the Constitution on a whim.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of safeguards, let's move on to Chapter 6, the judicature. This is where things get really interesting because it's all about the courts, the guardians of justice, the interpreters of the law. Think like dramatic courtroom scenes and weighty legal arguments and decisions that can change the course of history.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat now. So let's start with the High Court and the Court of Appeal. What are their roles and how are the judges appointed?
Well, Sections 95 through 102 walk us through the structure. The High Court handles, like most of the serious cases, while the Court of Appeal hears appeals from the High Court. Judges for both are appointed by the president, but not alone. The president has to act on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission.
Checks and balances in action. I love to see it. A system that keeps any one person from getting too much power.
Exactly. It helps make sure the judiciary is independent and impartial. And that's essential for a fair legal system.
All right, Chapter 7, the public service. Is this like talking about the post office and stuff?
Not quite. This chapter focuses on the civil service, the people who work for the government to keep things running and put policies into action. So it's about making sure the public service is professional and unbiased.
Okay, so who keeps those civil servants in line?
Well, that would be the Public Service Commission. It's laid out in Section 109. They handle appointing and promoting and disciplining public officers, so they ensure the integrity of the civil service. And then Section 111 allows for appeals to the president in certain cases. So again, it's all about preventing any abuse of power.
Wow, they really did think of everything, huh? They've put systems in place to prevent all kinds of problems.
Yeah, they really have. It's impressive. Okay, now let's move on to Chapter 8, Finance. This might sound a little boring, but trust me, it's actually pretty interesting.
All right, I'm intrigued. What's so interesting about government finances?
So for one thing, we get to learn about the consolidated fund in Sections 117 and 118. You can think of it like the government's bank account. So we see where the money comes from and where it goes. It's all about transparency and accountability.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing a theme here. It's like every chapter is about making sure power is used responsibly and that the people are protected.
You got it. And to make sure that happens, we have the Auditor General, which is in Section 124. This is an independent watchdog who audits the government's finances. Then they report anything fishy to Parliament, like having an extra set of eyes to make sure the public's money is being used wisely.
It's amazing how much thought they put into making this document. It's like a well-oiled machine with each part doing its job to keep the whole thing running smoothly.
That's a great way to put it. But we're not done yet. We still have to talk about Chapter 9, Miscellaneous.
Miscellaneous. Sounds like just a bunch of random legal stuff.
Well, not really. It covers some pretty important things like resignations and reappointments, and even how to interpret the Constitution itself. And this is all laid out in sections 125 through 127. It's like the instruction manual for making sure the Constitution works as it should.
So any interesting tidbits in there?
Well, there's section 127, which deals with consecutive terms of imprisonment. So it raises questions about how the law actually works. Like how those terms are defined. Is it like back-to-back sentences, or can there be time in between?
I love how even the little details can have big implications. That's why we do these deep dives. Okay, so we can't forget about the supporting cast here, right? The schedules.
Of course not. They provide all those extra details and procedures that really flesh out the framework from the main chapters. Think of them like footnotes that clarify and expand upon the main text.
All right, so first up is the first schedule, electing the specially elected members. We touched on that earlier. So how does this unique process actually work?
It's a bit of a political thriller, to be honest.
Yeah.
Nominations come from both the president and the elected members of parliament, and then there's a secret ballot. Imagine the deals and the maneuvering that must go on behind the scenes.
I bet. And what happens if there's a tie? Do they just keep voting forever?
Well, paragraph 9 talks about that. It outlines the procedure for breaking a tie.
Yeah.
They want to make sure the process doesn't get stuck.
Makes sense. Okay, and finally, we have the second schedule dividing Botswana for Netlo ya Dikosi.
Right. This one's all about geography. It divides Botswana into regions for selecting members of the Netlo ya Dikosi, which is the House of Traditional Leaders. So this house has a really important job representing the interests of all the different tribes and communities.
Wow. It's fascinating to see how the Constitution balances modern government with those traditional structures. It really is a comprehensive document. Covers everything from individual rights to all those little details about how the government actually works. We've covered a lot here.
We have. But there's still so much more to unpack. So in the next part of our deep dive, we'll go even deeper in some of the key themes and implications of this amazing document.
Sounds good. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue our exploration of the Botswana Constitution. Welcome back. So we just finished going through the chapters and schedules of the Botswana Constitution, and I gotta say, it's even more fascinating than I thought it would be.
It really is a remarkable document. You're right, we covered a lot, but I think it's good to take a minute and think about some of the key takeaways. And you know what makes this Constitution so unique?
Okay, so what really stands out to you when you kind of zoom out and look at the big picture?
Well, one thing that I find really interesting is just how much they emphasize individual rights and freedoms. Like right from the beginning, in Chapter 2, they lay out all these protections for individuals.
Yeah. The right to life, liberty, privacy protection from the government taking your stuff unfairly, it's all right there.
Yeah.
It seems like they really wanted to make sure that individual citizens had protection, from the government having too much power.
Exactly. Yeah. And they don't just say it. They go into detail about how these rights are protected and what the limits are. So clearly, they put a lot of thought into balancing those freedoms with what the government needs to do.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to find that perfect balance between freedom and a society that functions well.
Exactly. And another thing that's super interesting is how they structured their government. They built in all these checks and balances, like the separation of powers between the executive and legislative and judicial branches, and then all the oversight mechanisms, like the Auditor General and the Public Service Commission.
It seems like they really went all out to prevent any one person or group from having too much power.
They did, and that's like a classic sign of a well-designed democracy. They clearly learned from what's happened in other countries and tried to build a system that's tough to corrupt and hard to abuse.
It's really inspiring to see how much work they put into creating a system that's fair and just.
It is. Yeah. And I think it says a lot about what the people of Botswana believe in. They clearly value individual freedom and democracy and good governance.
Makes me wonder how they managed to come up with such a balanced and forward-thinking constitution.
That's a great question. We have to remember that no constitution just appears out of nowhere. They're products of their time and place, shaped by historical events and cultural influences, and the vision of the people who actually wrote them.
So to really get the Botswana Constitution, we need to get Botswana's history.
Yeah, exactly. We need to look at their fight for independence, their cultural values. All that played a role in making this document what it is today.
Now that's fascinating. It makes me want to go read up on Botswana's history and see how it all connects.
I definitely recommend it. I think it'll give you a much deeper understanding of the Constitution and their journey as a nation.
All right, so we talked about how they emphasize individual rights and all those checks and balances. What else jumps out at you as we keep exploring?
Well, one thing that's particularly interesting is how the Constitution balances modern government with their traditional ways of doing things.
Yeah, you're right. We saw that with the Netloya Degosi, the House of Traditional Leaders. You don't see that in every democracy.
Mm. It's unique, and it shows how much Botswana wants to include their cultural heritage and their traditional systems of authority into their modern government.
Yeah, it's like they're saying that their history and traditions matter and they have a place in their future.
Exactly. They're not just trying to copy Western-style democracies. They're making their own path,
Right.
one that respects their cultural identity, but also embraces modern ideas about governing.
It's a powerful message that democracy can look different in different places and that it's possible to create a system that's modern but still connected to its roots.
And I think that's a key takeaway from our deep dive into this Constitution. It makes us think outside the box a little. Consider different models of government and appreciate how different countries approach building a just society.
Yeah, it reminds us that there's no one right way to do democracy and that each country has to find its own path, one that reflects their history, their values, and what they hope for.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying constitutions so cool. They give you a look into the soul of a country. You see their hopes and fears and their vision for the future.
It is amazing how much we can learn from a single document. So as we wrap up this part of our dive view, what's one question that you would want our listener to think about as they keep learning about the Botswana Constitution?
I would ask them this. How does this constitution reflect the challenges and opportunities that Botswana has faced as a nation?
Oh, that's a good one. It forces you to think critically about why this document was created and to appreciate the unique circumstances that shaped it.
Exactly. It reminds us that constitutions aren't static. They're living things that change over time as societies change.
So our journey through this Constitution isn't over yet. There's still so much more to discover. So we'll continue our deep dive in part 3, where we'll go even deeper into this fascinating document. Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into the Botswana Constitution. I think we've explored pretty much every nook and cranny of this thing, chapter schedules, and we've really taken it apart and put it back together.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey
Mm.
from, those basic rights to the nitty-gritty of government finances. We've seen how this document affects everyone in Botswana.
Yeah, it's amazing how much detail and thought went into creating this thing. But now I'm starting to wonder, like, what does it all really mean? Why should we care about some constitution from a country so far away?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I think what's so cool about constitutions is that they're more than just some legal document. They really reflect a country's values and history and what it wants to be. They tell us who they are.
So it's not just about like rules, it's about getting the vibe of the whole nation.
Exactly. Take the emphasis on individual rights in Chapter 2, for example. That tells us how important personal freedom and human dignity are to Botswana.
And the way they set up their government, with all those checks and balances, that shows how much they want a system that's fair and accountable and, where it's hard for corruption to take root.
You got it. It's like they carefully built this system to protect both freedom and the common good.
Yeah.
A tough balance, but they recognize that a healthy society needs both.
Yeah. It's actually pretty inspiring. It makes you wonder how they managed to pull it off.
Well, we got to remember that no constitution is perfect. And even Botswana's has faced, its share of challenges and criticisms over time. But what's impressive is that they're always open to dialogue and reform. They're always trying to improve their system and make it work better for their people.
Right. That's an important point. Constitutions aren't supposed to be like set in stone. They need to change and adapt as societies change.
Exactly. And that's where interpretation is so important. Courts, legal scholars, even everyday citizens, they all have a role in figuring out how a constitution is understood and used.
So it's like a living document, always being shaped by the people it governs.
You got it. And that's why it's crucial for us to engage with these texts, understand them, and participate in the conversations about what they mean and how they affect things.
So that's a great takeaway for our listeners. Don't just listen to this stuff. Think about it. Really engage with it.
Couldn't agree more. Ask questions, challenge what you think you know, and think critically about how these ideas could apply to your own life in your own community.
So for our listener who's been with us through this whole thing, what's like a final thought-provoking question to leave them with?
If you could take one idea from this Constitution and put it into practice in your own country, what would it be and why?
That's a great question. It gets us thinking about how things could be different and how different ideas from constitutions could shape our own societies.
We've seen how the Botswana Constitution balances individual rights with the needs of the state, how it carefully lays out the powers and limits of the government, and how it tries to ensure accountability everywhere. It's such a cool example of how a nation can create a plan for a fair and just society.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the Botswana Constitution. We hope you've enjoyed this journey and learned something new about the power of constitutions, not just in Botswana, but everywhere.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning. There's a whole world of fascinating constitutional ideas out there just waiting to be discovered.